This 1911 studio photograph looks graceful, until you notice why the mother is hiding her hand. Dr. Alan Garrett had examined thousands of photographs during his 20-year career as a curator at the Chicago History Museum. But something about this particular portrait made him pause. The image was dated April 1911, taken at Muller's photography studio on West Madison Street. A woman in her early 30s sat in an ornate chair, her posture elegant and composed, wearing a dark dress with delicate lace at the collar. Beside her stood a boy of about 5, his hand resting on his mother's shoulder, his expression serious in the way children often looked in formal portraits of that era. The photograph had arrived as part of a donated collection from an estate in Pilsen, one of Chicago's historic immigrant neighborhoods. Most of the images in the collection were straightforward family portraits, wedding photos, and street scenes from the early 20th century. This one seemed no different at first glance, just another middle-class family documenting their lives during Chicago's industrial boom. But Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He adjusted his desk lamp and pulled out his magnifying glass, studying the photograph more carefully. The woman's face showed a peculiar tension. Her smile was present but strained, her eyes holding something that looked like determination mixed with pain. The boy appeared anxious, his small hand gripping his mother's shoulder as if seeking reassurance. Then Alan noticed the pose itself. The woman's left hand was clearly visible, resting naturally on her lap. But her right hand was completely hidden, tucked behind the folds of her dress in a way that seemed deliberate yet awkward. The positioning looked uncomfortable, almost forced. He examined the photographer's staging more closely. Studio portraits from this period typically followed strict conventions. Hands were usually displayed prominently, often holding props like flowers, books, or handkerchiefs. Hiding a hand was unusual, even strange. It broke the aesthetic rules that photographers religiously followed. Alan reached for his computer and began enhancing the digital scan of the photograph, adjusting contrast and brightness to reveal hidden details. As the image became clearer, he noticed something he had missed before. The fabric of the woman's dress on the right side showed an unusual bunching, as if she was gripping something tightly beneath the material, or as if the hand itself was somehow irregular in shape. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice by the photographer. The woman was deliberately concealing her right hand, and the photograph had been carefully composed to accommodate that concealment while maintaining the appearance of a normal family portrait. The next morning, Alan arrived at the Chicago Municipal Archives in the Daly Center, carrying a folder with enlarged prints of the photograph and what little information he had gathered. The building's basement housed records dating back to the city's incorporation, including employment records, court documents, and industrial accident reports from the early 20th century. He signed in with the archivist, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen who had worked in the archives for over 30 years. Alan showed her the photograph and explained what he had noticed about the hidden hand. "I'm trying to identify this woman and understand why she would pose this way," he said. The donation records mention the family worked in the meatpacking district around 1911. "I'm hoping to find employment records or anything that might explain the unusual pose." Helen studied the photograph carefully, her expression thoughtful. The meatpacking plants kept detailed employee records because of insurance requirements and union disputes. If she worked for one of the major companies, Swift, Armour, Morris, there should be documentation. She paused, looking more closely at the woman's face. "But if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you should also check the industrial accident reports." Alan felt his stomach tighten. Industrial accidents? "The meatpacking district was one of the most dangerous places to work in Chicago," Helen replied. "Between the sharp equipment, the fast line speeds, and the lack of safety regulations, injuries were constant. Hand injuries especially, lost fingers, crushed bones, lacerations. Most went unreported, but some were documented, particularly if they led to disputes over compensation or termination." She led him to a section of the archives filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes. "Start with the accident reports from 1910 to 1911. If something happened to her hand, there might be a record." Alan spent the entire day sifting through documents. The accident reports were heartbreaking in their frequency and casual tone. Worker lost 2 fingers, line 7, beef processing or hand-crushed sausage packing machine, worker dismissed. Each entry represented a person's livelihood destroyed, a family's income eliminated, yet they were recorded with the same indifference one might use to note a broken piece of equipment. As afternoon faded into evening, Alan found something that made him stop breathing. An accident report dated January 14, 1911 from the Armor Canning Company. Female worker, Rose, age 31, right hand injury, machine malfunction, 2 fingers severed at second knuckle. Worker terminated same day per company policy. No compensation issued, just Rose. No surname in the report, which was common for female workers. But the age matched, the timing matched, and the injury would explain why she had hidden her hand in the photograph taken just 3 months later. Alan returned to the museum the following morning with copies of the accident report, but his excitement was tempered by frustration. Rose was a common name in 1911 Chicago, especially among the city's large Polish, Irish, and German immigrant populations. Without a surname, tracking her through census records or city directories would be nearly impossible. He decided to approach the problem differently. If Rose had been terminated without compensation after a severe workplace injury, and if she had fought back legally, there should be court records. He returned to the archives that afternoon, requesting access to Cook County Circuit Court files from 1911. The court records were organized by case type and date, stored in leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and dust. Alan started with cases filed between January and June 1911, searching for any mention of workplace injury lawsuits against the Armor Canning Company. It took 3 days of searching, but he finally found it. Case number 1911, CV 2847, filed April 2, 1911. Rose Kowalski vs. Armor and Company, employer liability for workplace injury. The case file was thick, containing depositions, witness statements, company records, and trial transcripts. Alan's heart raced as he opened the file and began reading. The complaint, filed by an attorney named Bernard Hirsch, laid out the facts with devastating clarity. Rose Kowalski, a 31-year-old widow and mother, had worked at Armor's canning facility for 3 years. On January 14, 1911, while operating a can sealing machine, a mechanical failure caused the press to activate while her hand was inside, severing her index and middle fingers at the second knuckle. The company's response was immediate and brutal. Rose was terminated the same day, told that injured workers were a liability. She was given no medical care beyond basic first aid, no compensation for her injury, and no severance pay. But Rose hadn't accepted that fate quietly. She had approached Bernard Hirsch, a young attorney known for taking workers' compensation cases, and convinced him to file suit. The case argued that Armor had been negligent in maintaining safe equipment and that Illinois law should recognize an employer's duty to provide safe working conditions. Alan flipped through the depositions and found Rose's testimony. Her words revealed a woman of remarkable clarity and courage. She described the accident in precise detail, explained how she had reported the malfunctioning machine to her supervisor multiple times, and documented how the company had ignored her complaints. The trial had taken place over 3 weeks in March and April 1911. Alan made copies of everything, his mind connecting the timeline, the accident in January, the lawsuit filed in April, and the photograph taken on April 18, 1911, right in the middle of the trial. Rose had posed for that portrait while fighting the most important battle of her life. Alan spent the next week immersed in the trial transcripts, reading hundreds of pages of testimony that painted a vivid picture of Rose's fight for justice. The case had been groundbreaking for its time, one of the first in Illinois to seriously challenge the doctrine that employers bore no responsibility for workplace injuries, a legal principle that essentially held workers responsible for any dangers inherent in their jobs. Bernard Hirsch had built his case methodically. He called witnesses who testified about the machine's history of malfunctions, introduced maintenance records showing that repairs had been repeatedly delayed, and presented Rose's own documentation of her complaints to supervisors. He brought in medical experts who described the severity of her injury and the permanent disability it caused. But it was Rose's own testimony that formed the heart of the case. Alan read through her words, struck by their power and precision. When asked why she had continued working at a job she knew was dangerous, Rose had replied, "I am a widow with a young son. I have no other means of supporting us. I reported the danger because I hoped it would be fixed. I continued working because I had no choice." The defense attorney, representing Armour & Company, had attempted to discredit her, suggesting she had been careless, that she had operated the machine incorrectly. The transcript showed Rose responding to each accusation with calm, factual rebuttals, often citing specific dates, times, and witnesses that contradicted the company's claims. One exchange particularly moved Allen. The defense attorney had asked, "Mrs. Kowalski, if the work was so dangerous, why did you not simply quit and find other employment?" Rose's response had been delivered with quiet intensity. "You ask that question because you have never been a widow with a child, with rent due and no savings, in a city where factory owners share lists of workers they consider troublemakers. You ask that question because you have never faced the choice between danger and starvation." The courtroom had fallen completely silent after her answer. Allen found newspaper coverage of the trial in the Chicago Tribune archives. The case had attracted significant attention from labor advocates and progressive reformers who saw it as a test case for workers' rights. Editorials debated whether employers should be held responsible for workplace safety, with business interests arguing that such liability would destroy American industry. The trial had concluded on April 15, 1911, but the jury had deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. During those 3 days, Rose had gone to Muller's photography studio and posed for the portrait with her son, her injured hand carefully hidden, her future uncertain. Allen's hands trembled as he turned to the final pages of the case file. The jury's verdict had been delivered on April 18, 1911, the same day Rose had her photograph taken. The timing couldn't be coincidental. She had learned the outcome that morning and had gone directly to the photography studio that afternoon. The verdict? In favor of Rose Kowalski. The jury found that Armour & Company had been negligent in maintaining safe equipment and had failed to provide a reasonably safe workplace. They awarded Rose $1,200 in damages, equivalent to roughly 2 years of factory wages, and a substantial sum for the time. But the financial award was less significant than the legal precedent. The judge's written opinion stated that Illinois employers had a duty of care toward their employees and could be held liable for injuries resulting from negligence. It was one of the first such rulings in the state, establishing a foundation for what would eventually become workers' compensation law. Allen found newspaper coverage of the verdict in the Chicago Tribune's April 19, 1911 edition. The headline read, "Widow Wins Landmark Case Against Meatpacking Giant." The article described Rose as a woman of remarkable composure and determination, and quoted Bernard Hirsch saying, "This verdict affirms that workers are human beings deserving of basic protections." The article included a detail that made Allen's throat tighten. Mrs. Kowalski stated that she had taken her young son for a portrait photograph to commemorate the day, saying, "I want him to remember that his mother fought for what was right, and that sometimes justice prevails." Phew, that explained the photograph. It wasn't about vanity or documentation. It was about legacy. Rose wanted her son to have a physical record of this moment, proof that she had stood up to power and won. She had hidden her injured hand not out of shame, but because she wanted to be remembered for her courage and victory, not for what had been taken from her. Allen searched through city directories from subsequent years, tracking the Kowalski name. He found Rose listed in the 1912 directory as Rose Kowalski seamstress, working from her home. By 1915, she had opened her own small dressmaking shop. The 1920 census showed her still working as a dressmaker, her son James working as her assistant. Despite losing 2 fingers, Rose had rebuilt her life. She had used her settlement money to establish independence, to create work she could do despite her injury. Allen found one more document, an oral history interview conducted in 1958 with James Kowalski. The interviewer had asked about his mother's famous case. She never talked about her hand, James had said. Never complained, never expressed bitterness, but she kept that photograph on our mantle my entire childhood. Alan's discovery of Rose's story opened new avenues of research. He wanted to understand the broader impact of her case, how it had influenced subsequent legal decisions and labor reforms. He reached out to Professor Linda Chen at Northwestern University's School of Law, an expert in labor law history who had written extensively about early 20th century workers' rights cases. They met at a cafe near the university, where Alan spread out copies of the documents he had found. Professor Chen studied them with growing excitement, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "I've read about Kowalski versus Armour in legal textbooks, but I've never seen the complete case file. Most historians focus on the legal precedent without examining the human story behind it." She pointed to Rose's testimony. This woman was building a case the way a lawyer would, documenting incidents, preserving evidence, creating a timeline. "What made her case so significant legally?" Alan asked. Professor Chen leaned forward, her voice animated. "Before cases like Rose's, the doctrine of assumption of risk basically meant that if you took a job, you accepted all the dangers that came with it. Employers argued they weren't responsible for injuries because workers knew the risks. It was designed to protect corporate profits at the expense of human life." She flipped through the trial transcripts. Rose's case challenged that doctrine directly. Her attorney argued, and the jury agreed, that there's a difference between normal workplace risks and dangers created by employer negligence. The machine had been reported as faulty multiple times. The company knew it was dangerous and did nothing. That's not assumption of risk, that's negligence. "How did other courts respond?" Alan asked. Within 2 years of Rose's verdict, at least 15 similar cases were filed in Illinois, all citing Kowalski versus Armour as precedent. Most settled before trial because employers knew they would lose. By 1915, the Illinois legislature had passed some of the nation's first workers' compensation laws, creating a system where injured workers could receive benefits without having to sue. Professor Chen nodded toward the photograph. Rose's victory created a legal pathway that thousands of workers followed. It demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge powerful corporations and win. It shifted the entire framework of how we think about workplace safety and employer responsibility. Alan felt a surge of pride for a woman he had never met. "She must have known how important this was," he said. Professor Chen smiled. "I think she did. Look at how carefully she prepared, how she kept records. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategic. She understood she was fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her." While Alan had uncovered the public triumph of Rose's legal victory, he began to wonder about the personal toll it had taken. Challenging a powerful corporation in 1911 required not just courage, but also an ability to withstand social and economic pressure. He decided to search for more information about Rose's life during and after the trial. He returned to the archives and requested access to city welfare records, charitable organization files, and church registries from the Pilsen neighborhood where Rose had lived. These documents often contain details about families in crisis, applications for assistance, requests for support, records of community aid. In the files of St. Adalbert's Catholic Church, he found a series of entries that painted a more complex picture. In February 1911, shortly after Rose's injury and termination, the church had provided the Kowalski family with food assistance and help paying rent. A note from the parish priest mentioned that Mrs. Kowalski is recovering from a workplace injury and seeking legal counsel. The family is in need, but maintaining dignity. Further entries showed that the church community had supported Rose throughout the trial, with parishioners taking turns watching her son while she attended court sessions. One note, dated March 1911, mentioned that certain members of the congregation employed by Armour have been warned by their supervisors not to associate with Mrs. Kowalski or risk termination. Alan felt his anger rising. The company hadn't just fired Rose. They had tried to isolate her, to make her fight alone by threatening anyone who might support her. The fact that her community had stood by her despite those threats spoke to both her character and theirs. He found more evidence of the pressure Rose had faced in newspaper archives. Letters to the editor revealed a fierce debate about Rose's case. Some praised her courage, others condemned her as greedy and ungrateful, arguing that she should accept her fate and not burden the courts with complaints about industrial accidents. One letter from a factory worker stated, "I have worked in Chicago's packing houses for 15 years. I have seen dozens of workers lose fingers, hands, even arms. Companies treat us as disposable. Mrs. Kowalski is fighting for all of us." Alan found an interview with Rose published in a labor newspaper in May 1911. The interviewer had asked about the personal cost of the lawsuit. "It has been difficult," Rose admitted. "There were days when I doubted myself, when the pressure made me question whether I should continue. But then I remembered why I started, not just for myself, but for every worker who has been injured and discarded. If I had remained silent, nothing would change." Alan sat back, moved by Rose's words. She had understood the stakes, had accepted the personal cost, and had fought anyway. Alan's research continued into the years following Rose's landmark victory. He wanted to understand how she had used her settlement money and how her case had influenced her son's future. Using genealogy databases and public records, he traced James's descendants and discovered that his younger daughter Dorothy, whose estate had donated the photograph collection, had died in 2020. Her children were still alive and living in the Chicago area. Alan reached out through official channels, requesting an interview. Within a week, he received a response from Dorothy's daughter, a woman named Patricia, who was intrigued by Alan's interest in her great-grandmother's story. They met at Patricia's home in Oak Park, a comfortable house filled with family photographs and heirlooms. Patricia, a retired teacher in her 60s, welcomed Alan warmly and led him to a dining room table where she had spread out boxes of family documents. "I knew my great-grandmother's case was significant," Patricia said, "but I never fully understood the details until you contacted me. My grandmother used to tell stories, but they were always framed as family history, not legal history." She pulled out a box of letters and photographs. "These belonged to my grandmother. After she died, my mother kept them. When Mom died, I inherited everything, and I donated most of the photographs to the museum, but I kept some of the more personal items." Alan's heart raced as Patricia showed him the contents. There were letters from Rose to James written over several decades. There were newspaper clippings about the trial, carefully preserved, and there, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small cloth pouch. Patricia opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the table. 2 small metal objects fell out. Alan stared at them, confused at first, then realized with shock what he was looking at. 2 preserved finger bones, the very fingers Rose had lost in the factory accident. "My great-grandmother kept them," Patricia said quietly. "According to family stories, after the accident, she insisted on keeping her severed fingers. She had them preserved and kept them in this pouch for the rest of her life." Alan felt a chill. Why would she keep them? Patricia smiled sadly. "My grandmother explained it this way. Great-Grandma Rose said those fingers weren't just flesh and bone. They were evidence. They were proof of what had happened to her. Tangible evidence that couldn't be disputed or denied. She kept them as a reminder of why she had fought." She pulled out a letter, yellowed with age. "This was written to my grandfather James in 1945, shortly before Great-Grandma Rose died." Patricia read aloud, "My dear son, I am leaving you this pouch. These fingers represent the most important lesson I can teach you. They cost me pain, but they bought something more valuable. They bought justice. Keep them, remember them, and teach your children that silence in the face of injustice is surrender." Armed with the complete story, Alan returned to the museum to examine the photograph one final time. He now understood every element of it: the timing, the pose, the hidden hand, the expression on Rose's face. It was no longer just a portrait, but a complex historical document that captured a moment of triumph, defiance, and deep personal significance. He arranged the photograph on his desk alongside all the documents he had gathered: the accident report, the trial transcripts, the newspaper clippings, Rose's letters, and photographs of the preserved fingers. Together, they formed a complete narrative of one woman's fight for justice and dignity. Alan decided to create an exhibition at the museum telling Rose's story through these artifacts. He worked with the museum's education department to develop materials about labor history, workers' rights, and the legal precedents established by Rose's case. He contacted local schools, offering to bring the exhibition to students studying American history or social justice. The exhibition, titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Rose Kowalski and the Fight for Workers' Rights, opened in September 2023. The centerpiece was the photograph, displayed prominently with detailed explanations of its context and significance. Beside it, Allen had mounted enlarged excerpts from Rose's testimony, the jury's verdict, and the judge's opinion establishing employer liability. The exhibition also included a section on the broader impact of Rose's victory, showing how her case had influenced subsequent legal decisions and labor reforms. Professor Chen had contributed a timeline showing the progression from Rose's case to the establishment of comprehensive workers' compensation systems across the United States. The most powerful element was a video presentation featuring Patricia reading her great-grandmother's letters and explaining the family's perspective on Rose's legacy. Patricia had agreed to loan the preserved fingers to the museum for the exhibition, displayed in a respectful educational context that explained their significance as evidence and symbol. The exhibition attracted significant attention. Local news stations covered the opening, and several labor organizations held events at the museum. Teachers brought students to see the exhibition, using Rose's story to discuss themes of courage, justice, and civic engagement. Allen gave a talk at the opening, standing before the photograph and addressing a packed auditorium. "When I first saw this image," he said, "I noticed something unusual, a hand deliberately hidden. That observation led me to discover not just one woman's story, but a crucial chapter in American labor history." He gestured to the photograph. Rose Kowalski hid her hand not because she was ashamed, but because she refused to be defined by her injury. This photograph celebrates her victory. It documents a moment when justice prevailed. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Allen received an email from a labor attorney named Michael, who represented workers in a current lawsuit against a major warehouse company over unsafe working conditions. Michael had visited the exhibition and been struck by the parallels between Rose's case and the modern situation his clients faced. "I've been working on this case for 2 years," Michael wrote, "and I've struggled to articulate to the jury why employer negligence matters. Then I saw Rose Kowalski's testimony, saw how she built her case, saw how she refused to let the company define her. I'd like to discuss using her case as historical precedent." Allen met with Michael, bringing copies of the trial transcripts and legal documents. They discussed the legal strategy Rose's attorney had used, the careful documentation of complaints, the establishment of the company's knowledge of dangers, the proof that the company had prioritized profits over safety. Over the following months, Michael incorporated elements of Rose's case into his legal strategy. He used Rose's story to humanize his clients, to help the jury understand that behind every workplace injury was a person with dignity and rights. He showed them the photograph, explained Rose's fight, and drew direct parallels to his client's situation. The case went to trial in early 2024. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury found in favor of the workers. The company was ordered to pay damages and implement comprehensive safety reforms. In his closing argument, Michael had held up a copy of Rose's photograph and said, "Over a century ago, Rose Kowalski proved that workers' lives matter. Her victory established principles that still govern us today." After the verdict, several of Michael's clients visited the museum. One woman, who had lost 3 fingers in a warehouse accident, stood before Rose's photograph for a long time, tears streaming down her face. "She fought for me," the woman said quietly to Allen. "She fought 100 years before I was born, and she fought for me." Allen felt the weight of that connection, how Rose's courage had created ripples that still touched lives over a century later. The photograph, which had seemed like a simple family portrait, had become a symbol of resistance and dignity that transcended time. The exhibition ran for 6 months, attracting over 30,000 visitors. When it closed, Allen worked with the museum to create a permanent display about Rose's case. The photograph now hangs in the museum's labor history gallery, accompanied by a detailed explanation of its significance. Patricia donated Rose's preserved fingers to the museum's collection. In a ceremony marking the donation, Patricia spoke about her great-grandmother's legacy. Rose Kowalski believed that her suffering had meaning only if it created change, Patricia said. She didn't just want justice for herself, she wanted to build a foundation that others could stand on. This photograph is her gift to us. It reminds us that one person's courage can reshape the world. Alan watched as visitors continued to stream through the gallery. The photograph no longer looked like a simple portrait. It looked like what it truly was: evidence of victory, a declaration of dignity, and a bridge connecting past struggles to present fights for justice. Rose had posed for that photograph knowing it would outlive her, hoping it would tell her story when she could no longer tell it herself. Over a century later, her story was being told, her courage celebrated, and her legacy inspiring people to fight for dignity just as she had done.